Friends, today we will talk about the loud statements of the American media figure Tucker Carlson, who was not afraid to openly call members of the U.S. Senate people with low intelligence and clowns. He also expressed doubt about the widespread stereotype in the West that Russia is supposedly just a gas station with nuclear weapons. These words, coming from one of the most famous and popular TV presenters in the United States, have become a real challenge to those who are accustomed to unequivocally accuse Russia and belittle its role on the world stage. What was the reason for Carlson's harsh rhetoric? Why is he convinced that the standard of living in Russian cities has grown significantly over the past 25 years, while major American megacities such as New York, Chicago, and Baltimore are experiencing serious problems? Where did his sympathy for Vladimir Putin come from, whom the United States is used to demonizing? To understand these issues, watch this video to the end. Believe me, it's definitely worth your attention. Tucker Carlson, the former host of one of the most popular political programs on the largest American television channel, became widely known for his uncompromising style, his ability to ask uncomfortable questions, and his ability to touch on the sore points of his interlocutors. His views on Russia are causing heated debate among both liberal and conservative circles in the United States. Some consider him a man loyal to the Kremlin, while others see him as the only journalist who dares to tell the truth, inconvenient for the American establishment. Carlson himself claims to be tired of the stereotypes and propaganda cliches used by American politicians when discussing Russia. He once said that America should not become a country where people are judged solely by their nationality or last name. This position stands in stark contrast to the wave of anti-Russian sentiment that has swept the Western media over the past few years. In one of his last interviews, Tucker Carlson spoke sharply about the U.S. Senate, calling it a bunch of low intellectual clowns. According to him, the vast majority of American parliamentarians thoughtlessly agree with other people's statements about Russia, without even trying to figure out the real state of affairs. He recalled that the stereotype of Russia as a gas station with nuclear warheads was actively promoted, among others, by the late Senator John McCain. Carlson openly accused him of lacking an elementary understanding of history, culture, and the real state of things in Russia. The TV presenter emphasizes that anyone who has visited Russia at least once or is familiar with its classical literature will not use primitive labels. He makes fun of American politicians who, in his opinion, have spent their entire lives in closed conference rooms and have not even tried to read Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace or to understand the meaning of Dostoevsky's works. From Carlson's point of view, presenting the Russian people as absolute evil or reducing the whole country to the concept of gas stations is not only a simplistic, but also an extremely dangerous view of the world. The journalist reminds that Russia is a state with a centuries-old history and a powerful culture, which also has the world's largest nuclear arsenal. To reduce such a complex phenomenon to a propaganda cliché is to completely ignore the key aspects that shape Russian politics and national identity. At the same time, Carlson does not claim that Americans should love or support Russia. He only insists that this country should be taken seriously and not perceived as an object for ridicule and superficial generalizations. The journalist is particularly outraged by cases when people are discriminated against only because of their nationality or citizenship. He cites as an example the situation with Russian athletes, who in recent years have been barred from international tournaments or forced to compete without a national flag. Carlson compares this to the era of McCarthyism, when any ties with an undesirable country could lead to repression and persecution. The journalist emphasizes that he does not want to live in a country where such practices are becoming the norm. In his opinion, this goes against the very American principles of equality, freedom, and justice. He recalls that the United States has always positioned itself as a country where everyone has equal opportunities, regardless of origin. However, in recent years, in his opinion, these ideals have increasingly been replaced by the political situation. But perhaps one of the most resonant topics in Carlson's recent speeches was his comparison of the standard of living in Russia and the United States. He argues that over the past 25 years, Russian cities have significantly transformed, while many American megacities, on the contrary, have degraded. According to the journalist, if you look at Moscow or St. Petersburg today, you can see modern and well-maintained cities with clean streets, developed public transport, and safe areas. At the same time, American giants such as New York, Chicago, and Baltimore are suffering from rising crime, infrastructure problems, and a deteriorating quality of life. Carlson notes that American politicians prefer to ignore these problems, continuing to spend huge amounts of money on foreign policy adventures instead of developing their own country. He believes that if the U.S. authorities had paid more attention to domestic issues rather than demonizing Russia, Americans would have fared much better. According to Tucker Carlson, significant positive changes have taken place in Russia over the past 25 years, while American cities such as New York, Chicago, and Baltimore, on the contrary, have faced a serious deterioration in the situation. Some skeptics sarcastically recall the existing problems in Russian regions, but the journalist insists that objective data indicate an increase in incomes and improved infrastructure in the largest Russian cities. At the same time, American megacities faced neglect, rising crime, and serious social problems. Carlson's opponents object, arguing that it is impossible to compare two so different countries overnight. However, the journalist himself replies that if politicians like John McCain can reduce Russia to the image of a gas station, then why is it impossible to objectively assess the dynamics of living standards in both countries from the 1990s to the present day? Carlson does not limit himself to abstract statements, but gives concrete examples that clearly demonstrate the deteriorating situation in American megacities. He claims that New York has become dirtier, more chaotic, and more dangerous, while local authorities do not bear any responsibility for this. According to him, the level of street crime is growing, and problems such as drug addiction and homelessness have become alarming. And this applies not only to New York, but also to other once prosperous American cities that were previously considered a model of order and development. In contrast, Carlson cites Russian cities, which, in his opinion, have become safer and cleaner compared to the 1990s, when the country was experiencing a severe crisis after the collapse of the USSR. He admits that not everything is perfect in Russia, but emphasizes that the overall situation has improved, while American cities, on the contrary, have degraded. One of Carlson's most resonant statements was his position on Russian President Vladimir Putin. It has long been the norm in the American political environment to criticize Putin, accusing him of everything from interfering in the U.S. elections to establishing a special model of an authoritarian state. However, Tucker Carlson openly stated that he respects the Russian leader for his patriotism and ability to keep such a huge country with a multinational population and a complex history under control. According to the journalist, the collapse of Russia would be a global catastrophe because we are talking about a nuclear power, and a possible internal conflict could drag on for decades. He compares Russia's hypothetical collapse to a 5-year civil war, the consequences of which would be much worse than Western politicians assume. It is important to remind our viewers that Tucker Carlson is not just a theorist or a couch potato analyst who builds his conclusions on other people's reports and rumors. He personally came to Moscow last year and saw with his own eyes how things really are in the Russian capital. This visit was a real highlight, especially considering his reputation as a journalist who is not afraid to go against the generally accepted narrative. Instead of repeating old cliches about ruin and sanctions, he decided to check everything himself, and the results of his trip came as an unpleasant surprise to those who had been creating a myth about Russia in the Western media for years. First of all, Carlson went to an ordinary Moscow store to personally verify whether the sanctions had really led to empty shelves, as Western journalists like to tell us. The result turned out to be exactly the opposite. He was surprised by the abundance of goods, assortment, and prices, which, according to him, in some cases turned out to be even lower than in the United States. He noted that Western sanctions failed to bring the Russian economy to its knees, but on the contrary, pushed it to develop. It was a powerful blow to propaganda because now, in response to stories about a hungry Russia, you can simply show Carlson's report. After that, he turned his attention back to the Moscow metro, something that had impressed him during his previous visit. Carlson spoke with admiration about the beauty of the stations, their cleanliness and order, comparing it with the neglected state of public transport in American cities. He was particularly impressed by how well thought out and convenient everything was for passengers, from the timetable to the security level. At that moment, it became clear that he was not just doing a review out of curiosity, but was sincerely trying to understand why real Russia was so different from what it was portrayed in the Western media. Well, the culmination of his trip was, of course, an interview with Vladimir Putin, one of the most discussed events of the past year. This conversation immediately caused a storm of emotions in the West. Someone was outraged, someone admired, but no one remained indifferent. Carlson did not just give the floor to the Russian leader, but created a platform for an open dialogue, which Western media have long avoided. He asked pointed questions, listened to the answers, and let the audience draw their own conclusions. It is precisely such actions that distinguish a real journalist from a propagandist. You can relate to his views in different ways, but one thing is indisputable. He strives for the truth and is not afraid to look for it where others do not even try. American society has received Carlson's words about Putin ambiguously. In liberal circles, he was immediately accused of working for the Kremlin, and opinions were divided among conservatives. Some applaud him for his courage, others believe that he is too soft on Russia. The TV presenter himself fends off all attacks, stating that telling the truth and voicing non-trivial facts does not mean taking sides. He insists on objectivity based on logic and the real state of affairs, and not on propaganda cliches used by Washington politicians. According to him, if anyone dares to doubt the stereotype of Russia as a gas station, they are immediately declared an enemy. Reflecting on the future of Russia and its relations with the West, Tucker Carlson emphasizes that this country should not be underestimated, especially given the events of recent years. He hints that Western sanctions, contrary to the forecasts of many experts, did not lead to the collapse of the Russian economy, but, on the contrary, contributed to its reorientation to Eastern markets and the development of its own industries. As a result, the United States has failed to achieve its main goal, to sow chaos and destabilize Russia from within. According to Carlson, the reason for this is that in recent years there has been a strengthening of national consolidation in Russia, and patriotic sentiments have grown significantly. He emphasizes that if American politicians knew history better, they could have predicted such an outcome. The journalist reminds that the stronger the external pressure on Russia, the more united it becomes. Some interpret Tucker Carlson's words as if he enthusiastically supports Moscow's policy and justifies all its actions. However, the journalist himself claims that a critical analysis of the situation and even disagreement with certain aspects does not automatically mean going over to the enemy's side. He believes that American senators and congressmen should learn to listen to the arguments of opponents and respect someone else's point of view, rather than rushing to extremes, portraying Russia exclusively in a negative light, calling it a gas station or the embodiment of evil. In his opinion, American politicians should conduct a more mature and balanced dialogue. Carlson emphasizes that the United States itself has enough of its own problems that it should pay attention to first. In this context, he reiterates his position, stating that he does not want to live in a country where athletes with Russian surnames are discriminated against. He compares the actions of American sports organizations to a manifestation of national intolerance, which, in his opinion, runs counter to the fundamental principles of freedom and equality on which American society was originally built. Carlson draws a parallel with the period when athletes from South Africa were boycotted because of the policy of apartheid, although then there was a different political context and widespread international pressure was exerted on the country. Now, according to him, something similar is happening with regard to Russian players, and without an in-depth analysis of the situation. As a result, the journalist believes sports principles lose their value, and people who just want to compete at a professional level are being unfairly punished. However, he also has to pay a price for his popularity. He has been repeatedly accused of being too sympathetic to authoritarian regimes, and a number of media outlets have tried to portray his words about Russia as covert Kremlin propaganda. Carlson, however, ironically dismisses such accusations, arguing that an objective view of reality does not make a person a traitor to his country. He has formed the image of almost the only journalist in the American media space who is ready to discuss Russia without aggression and a caricatured approach. Friends, now I would like to express my opinion. I think the material with Tucker Carlson's statements turned out to be really interesting and important. In an era when many Western media outlets adhere to one-sided rhetoric, his honest and unbiased view of Russia looks fresh and bold. He is not trying to paint an idealized picture, but he also does not use the cliches that American politicians so often use. It is especially valuable that he draws attention not only to Russia's problems, but also to the crisis within the United States itself, because an objective analysis should always take into account both sides. This is respected, because not every journalist is ready to go against the mainstream, especially in such a complex topic. I would like to express my gratitude to Tucker Carlson for his balanced approach and desire to understand the real situation. In a world where there are so many preconceived opinions, his voice really stands out. Russia is always glad to see such people who are not afraid to seek the truth and speak it openly. I hope that he will visit our country more than once to see with his own eyes its development and the changes about which he speaks so boldly. If you agree with me and you like my content, please like and subscribe to the channel.